Everyone, how is it going? Luke here. In today's lesson of the Crushing Small Stakes PLO course, we're going to look into a very important topic where many of us, including myself, have been making a lot of mistakes in the past. Today we're going to focus on our small blind preflop strategy and focus specifically on our cold call ranges. First of all, we're going to look into some theory. Then we're going to jump into some candidates of hands that are capable of cold calling in the small blind. And lastly, I'm going to give you an assignment on how you can train your small blind cold call strategy. But before we're going to jump into that, I want to illustrate the mistakes that we're making by showing some of the hands that I recently played at PLO 50 and where I decided to make a cold call in the small blind. Here you see a hand where I decided to call in the small blind with King Jack 10 deuce double suited versus an early position open raise. Here's a hand where I called with Ace Queen Jack 3 single suited versus MP. Ace King Queen 7 single suited to the ace versus the cutoff. And here I decided to call with Jack 10 8-8 single suited versus the button. Now all these hands don't play great as a cold call in the small blind, and there are different reasons for that. First of all, these hands don't do great if they get squeezed by the big blind. Secondly, these hands are quite disconnected. Even though they look somewhat playable and they seem to have some sort of connectivity, they actually are quite marginal connected. And in addition to that, we don't pay enough attention to the rake impact that there is playing low stakes PLO. Later more on the differences of playing low stakes, mid stakes and high stakes and the impact on this on our cold call strategy. Now first of all, what do you think is the average cold call frequency by PLO 50 players in the small blind? Take a second to consider this and try to come up with a frequency that you think the population is calling here, or even yourself. Like, do you know what percentage of hands you're cold calling at the moment in the small blind? The population is actually cold calling 13% of hands in the small blind. This number is massively high, of course, and way too high for what we should actually cold call with in the small blind. Let's look at the differences between what we should actually cold call and what we are currently cold calling here. In a GTO simulation, we can see that first an early position open raise from the small blind, we are supposed to cold call 1% of our hands. Versus the button, we are supposed to cold call 2.7% of our hands in the small blind. Now, if you compare this to the population, you can see that they are cold calling 14% of the time from the small blind versus an early position raise and 12% versus a button. Now, I'm not saying that you are calling 14 or 12% in the small blind right now, but it's very likely that your number is way too high and that it's important to start paying attention to this and to work on it and to fix this, because it is quite easily fixed because the range is so narrow. Now, why is it that we are cold calling so wide in the small blind? First of all, we focus too much on our exact hand and we don't take a very holistic viewpoint to the situation. Secondly, we're unaware of our positional disadvantage. Obviously, we know we will be out of position throughout the entire hand, but we're not very conscious about it before we make the cold call. We're also unaware of the rake implications. We know we should be tighter from the small blind than, for example, mid stakes or high stakes, but we're not very sure how tight it is and what the differences actually are here. And fourthly, and very important as well, like we see mid stakes and high stakes players streaming on Twitch, for example, and we see them cold calling all sorts of hands in the small blind. But that doesn't mean that if you play low stakes, you can also call these specific hands as well. Let's look at these last two bullet points a little bit more closely. Let's compare the stakes. So low stakes, mid stakes versus high stakes. Here you see the hands we should cold call from the small blind versus early position RFI ranges. At low stakes, we're only supposed to cold call 1% of the hands. At mid stakes 3.4 and at high stakes 5.5. You can see these ranges gradually become wider. Versus the cutoff, 1.6% of the hands we are supposed to cold call at low stakes, 5.9 at mid stakes and 10.3 at high stakes. Now versus the button, these differences are also very high. 2.7% versus at low stakes, 7.9 at mid stakes and 13.4 at high stakes. The reason why I want to show you this is that there are massive differences at what stakes you're playing and what the rake levels there actually are. If you play mid stakes, you should cold call different hands than if you play high stakes. And if you play low stakes, you should call different hands pre-flop than if you play mid stakes or high stakes again. So it's important to keep this in mind and to focus on this, because the differences are quite big, as you can see. Now in today's lesson, we're going to look into versus early position, raise first in. And later, we're going to look into versus button, raise first in, when we are sitting in the small blind. Here you see a screenshot taken directly from the bucket tool. You can see 18 ranges used in our pre-flop chart, and the response of these ranges versus the raise from the small blind. In the green bars, you can see which ranges are interesting in having a calling range here. You can see there aren't too many, and that makes sense, of course, because we're only calling 1% of the hands. Now, the reason why this is still important is, first of all, because many of us are still calling way too many hands. You've seen that the population is calling around 14% of hands here. And secondly, even if you don't call 14% of the hands, it doesn't matter. It's very likely that you're still calling way too many hands. And the hands that we are supposed to cold call here is a very specific group of hands and have very specific characteristics. And I want to illustrate that by showing some of the examples here. We're going to look into some of the double-suited Broadway pairs. We're going to look into some of the double-suited rundowns. And we're going to look into some of the single-suited and rainbow double-paired hands. We're going to start it off by looking into the double-suited Broadway pairs here. Hands like King 5-4 and 10-9-8 double-suited are great hands to cold call here from the small blind versus an RFI from early position. Now these hands are too strong to fold here, but they also don't play great as a 3-bet, not blocking an ace and therefore not blocking 4-bet ranges. Another candidate to cold call here are double-suited rundowns like 8-7-6-5 and 7-6-5-3. Now you might think that these hands are much better off 3-betting instead of cold calling, but our 3-betting range with double-suited rundowns often ends at 9 high rundowns. So 8 high and lower rundowns are actually not often being used as a 3-bet, and especially not against these tight ranges. Lastly, single-suited and rainbow double paired. Hands like Queen 9-9 and 7-7-6-6 single-suited. These hands again, they are too strong to fold here, but they are still fine to make a call here with. They can flop quite deceptive and very strong, but by 3-betting they risk getting 4-bet as they don't block aces, and they don't do that well in a 4-bet pot here. Now let's look into another situation where we are sitting in the small blind and we face a button steal. Here you see a direct screenshot again from the bucket tool. In the green bars again, you can see our cold calling ranges. We have the 18 ranges again that we have been using. And you can see that we have some bars that are slightly higher now and wider than we have seen before versus early position. We're now calling 2.7% instead of only 1. Now I'm going to illustrate a few ranges here and a few hand examples that you are capable of cold calling with. We're going to look at the single-suited and rainbow Broadway pairs this time, double-suited mid-low pairs, and single-suited and rainbow rundowns. Let's first of all look into the single-suited Broadway pairs. Hands like Jack Queen 10 with 3 of the same suits is a great candidate to call with from the small blind versus a button steal, as well as King Queen 10 single-suited with the Queen high suit. These hands have a high pair and have connectivity and are therefore too strong to fold, but they don't play great as a 3-bet, not being double-suited and also not blocking any of the 4-betting ranges by not holding an ace. Double-suited mid-low pairs, for example, hands like 6-5-4-4 as well as 9-8-8-6. These hands are fine calls in the small blind, but they don't want a 3-bet here. The suits and the pairs will often be dominated in a 3-bet pot, but the hands are good enough to play here and give us board coverage on the mid and low pairs. The fact that we are double-suited is very important, given we have more playability going to the flop, and also we are now capable of calling a potential squeeze if the big blind comes over the top here. Other hands, single-suited rundowns, which are an interesting group of hands. Hands like King, Queen, Jack 10 with 3 of the same suits is a clear call here. If it would be single-suited with only 2 suits, you could potentially go for a 3-bet here as well sometimes, which is totally fine. But with 3 of the same suits, these hands aren't strong enough to go for the 3-bet. But because of the connectivity and the fact that we have a high rundown, the hand is strong enough to go for the call here. As well as Queen, Jack 10-8. We have a gap here, therefore the hand doesn't play that great in a 3-bet pot. We anyway always want to be careful 3-betting single-suited rundowns. But this hand is fine enough to go for the call here, given the fact that the connectivity here is good enough here. Now finally here, I want to give you some adjustments based on a low big blind squeeze. Many of the people at low stakes are not squeezing enough aggressively, and therefore we can sometimes get away by cold calling a few more hands in the small blind. We now know that sitting in the small blind versus a button steal, we are supposed to cold call 2.7% of the time. But if the big blind is not squeezing as wide as he should, but he's cold calling a little bit more hands there, we can get away by calling more hands, and our frequency can go up until 5.1% here. Now we'll upload this specific situation also to the G drive that is connected to the bucket tools. You can download it and get an idea of what this 5% range looks like. Before we're going to end up this video, I want to give you an assignment this week, because I think it's important to dive deeper into this specific topic. We have seen that many of us are cold calling way too many hands. We have also seen that we are supposed to cold call a very tight and narrow range and well defined. Now, because this range is so tight and well defined, it's quite easily fixed actually. There are only a very specific group of hands that we are supposed to cold call with. So I want to advise you, and I want to give you an assignment this week to jump into the bucket tool. Set yourself up in this scenario where you're sitting in the small blind facing a button steal or, for example, an early position raise, and dive in there and look at what hands you are supposed to cold call here. It's a very specific and well-defined group of hands. Use the 18 categories that we have been creating for this course and get a better understanding of what hands we are actually calling here with. I also want you to look into the 5.1% range where the big blind is not squeezing as wide. So here you can see like what hands you can potentially add to your cold calling range, because I would expect that many of you are cold calling at the moment between 5 and maybe 10% of the hands, and therefore this specific range can give you a good idea of what hands are actually supposed to be in there. Now I hope this lesson was valuable to you and gave you some insights into your small blind strategy. I think it's a very important topic and one of the biggest mistakes people are making pre-flop at low stakes PLO. We will definitely jump into other cold calling ranges as well later in the course. But for now, I will leave it like this, and I wish you all the best jumping into this bucket tool and into the sessions of training your small blind strategy. I will see you in the next video. Over and out. This was Luke for the PLO Mastermind.